even for the director of this institute, it's not an everyday occasion to be prepared for a topic which he likes and for a speaker whom he admires and likes. So very warm welcome to Angus Robertson. This is an evening devoted to something which we Viennese always think is quite natural. It's to the topic of Vienna being the capital of the world, sometimes we say, or the laboratory of the apocalypse, sometimes we say. Most of the time we say it's the musical capital of the world. Tonight it's the international city, Vienna, the international city. And you will hopefully all read the book of Angus Robertson. It's actually about people like me. It's about diplomats. It's a book full of diplomats, Austrian diplomats, who made a difference in the history of Vienna, and with that Austria. Mr. City Councillor, I'm sorry to say also Austria. And it's not only about the last few years, it's about 1,000 years, 900 years. We don't know how old Vienna is exactly. Angus gives some sort of hints when Vienna became capital, but only some sort of hints. And you would not expect by a person like Angus Robertson, who is one of the leading politicians in Scotland, of the Scottish National Party, that he has so much time to write a book, a real serious book about Vienna. But that is what he did. And I know this not only because of this presentation, but because of our contacts in the last few years, where I got the feeling that he spent more time in Austrian archives than in any other parliament in the United Kingdom, including the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. But maybe it's because Angus Robertson is such a special character that such a book could be written simply. Angus is bred and born in the UK, born in London, bred and coming into age in Edinburgh. He graduated from Aberdeen University, and then he made the decision that he goes to Central Europe. And he came to Vienna and actually was one of those voices a few generations of Austrians know from Austrian radio and television, from something that was called Blue Danube Radio at the time. And I guess there are a few guys around here also from the television radio who know what I'm talking about. Actually, since that time, he kept the contacts with Austria, although later on he deviated into politics and became member of parliament for the SNP, and even the chief whip of the SNP in Westminster Parliament, and was in his favor. I would love to say that he was also chairman of the bilateral friendship group between Austria and the United Kingdom, and he never tried to say it's between Austria and Scotland in that time. And when I was ambassador, so we had good contacts because he was an active chair British chair of this association. This ended in 2017, and then he decided to go back to Scotland mainly. He had the time to start writing this book. I guess he started when he left Westminster. That's my wild guess. But then he was elected to the Scottish Parliament and for Edinburgh Central. And now he is again high up in politics, this time Scottish politics directly. He is a cabinet secretary for the Constitution, Foreign Affairs and Culture. And under the term constitution, actually, I think what he is preparing to do is a new referendum campaign, and the rumor goes that he may be the main campaign manager for the SNP for the forthcoming, whenever it's forthcoming, referendum in Scotland. But this is already far beyond the book, because Tonight we will talk about Vienna, the international capital, and I'm much looking forward to the presentation of Angus Robertson. He presented the book the last 2 days in Edinburgh and in London, and now finally he arrived like the bird from high above to our poor, modest Central Europe, and there is no better place than the Diplomatische Akademie to present such a book to an Austrian audience. Welcome, Angus Robertson.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor, the privilege, and the pleasure to speak some words on behalf of the mayor of the city of Vienna, and he's also the governor of the state of Vienna, and that might maybe make also the difference why it's a success story for the city. And Vienna is a diplomatic center and a hub, as you mentioned, Emil, and 10,000 diplomats works here. And but Vienna is also a conference venue with more than 1,000 conferences a year. This is, ladies and gentlemen, before the corona came to us. And why I'm mentioning it, because usually Vienna, and you mentioned it also in your book, that the administration of the city and of the Rathaus is very interesting to emphasize and to foster this location. So all these conferences held in Vienna, usually they have the right, if they want, to get a reception by the mayor in the Rathaus. So they get an invitation, says the mayor invites you, and then someone else comes, myself. So most of them, they think I am the mayor, then they are very disappointed, and I tell them I'm not the mayor. But usually I try to tell them a story about Vienna. And I was thinking today, what shall I tell a story about Vienna, where the book is about Vienna? And I was thinking that Vienna has such different things to mention, because some cities are famous for something. And Vienna is really famous for a lot in terms of its diplomatic position, of the history, or you mentioned it, from Metternich to the Iranian negotiations, and Brezhnev, and Carter met in Vienna. I was still a student studying in Vienna, and I got all these things with. But then when you become a politician, and in my terms in urban planning and city planning and social housing, then you see there is a lot of conferences every time you meet someone. For some of them, Vienna is the capital for culture. Well, it's for opera houses, 300 galleries, 70,000 theater, and concert seats. Our 500 balls. I always say at that point, the Brazilians have their carnival and the Viennese have their balls. 500 balls are held in Vienna, and 450,000 Viennese go to dance there. This is something unique, for example, worldwide. On the other hand, you have a lot of delegations from Germany who are very impressed how it is possible to be in a city in Vienna with affordable housing, where 61% of all Viennese lives either in a household or a flat that either belongs to the city or is subsidized by the city. 61%, not 16. Really unbelievable, and that doesn't mean that the Viennese all are poor and they need it, but this is the thing. And on the other hand, it's already it's a university city. It's the largest, nobody believes it, is the largest university city in German-speaking cities in the world. We have more universities than in Berlin. 20 universities, 250,000 students studies in Vienna. 50,000 of them are foreigners who study here. We're a location of science. 480 life science institutions, more than 1,500 research institutions. 46,000 people work in this research, more than the diplomats were in this audience. Maybe the people would be focusing at it. So just to summarize, Vienna is history and heritage. It's a metropolis with a long history, combining old and new, past and future. It's a vibrant city. It's a young city. It's very interesting. Vienna is enlarging by, in average, 25,000 inhabitants a year. I know compared now to the Chinese dimensions, it's nothing, but believe me, for European dimensions, it's a lot. It means in the last 10 years, the city of Graz, which is the second largest city, moved to Vienna. And what does this mean? In terms in urban planning, we decided that 50% of the city should stay green. You mentioned that we're the #1 for life quality by Mercer in your book, but we're also the greenest city in the world. And believe me, it's the challenge is to master the challenge of a growing city. It's much better than to challenge the situation of shrinking cities, of aging cities. When we met now once the mayor of Sofia, she was complaining that there's no young people anymore. Everybody immigrated already. So what to do, how to keep the schools working, the theaters, the swimming locations. And we are at least, last but not least, a very smart city. And our philosophy of thinking of smart cities doesn't mean that the city is so smart and technological that the refrigerator is filled automatically when it's empty. But we thought of smart city being the city with social cohesion, with the impact to know and that everybody who wants to live in the city can afford to live in the city. So that's why you will find the academics, the diplomats, the vegetable sellers, the taxi drivers, the nurses, all of them. And when we are talking about the nurses, so it's also one of the hubs where with very high quality of healthcare, and more than 15 hospitals belong to the city and 14 private hospitals. And then we have the AKH, which is a mixture between a federal and a common hospital. But this is maybe also the thing that we have to mention, that it's sometimes unfair to compare mayors with mayors, because Vienna is also so successful due to its government, but we have to confess that the mayor and the government have, the law gives them more competencies than maybe other mayors. So the city government is not also only responsible for the parks and for collecting the garbage, it's also responsible for the healthcare, for the public transportation, for the social living system and all these things. So if you have the chance to handle all these components together, then you have the chance also to become a successful city. Thank you very much. I hope that I didn't exceed your patience, but Vienna is an international city with 188 nations are living here, 250 languages. I could now have delivered a speech in Arabic also, as once our foreign minister, you done this in New York, but I'm not going to do that now. So, but I'm also one of the persons who came to study to Vienna 41 years ago, and then I very soon realized it's easier and safer to become a politician in Vienna than to do this in Baghdad. So that's why. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those charming words, and it's always wonderful, even living in Vienna for so long, to get listed out again what makes the city so unique and fantastic and a great place to live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We get the great honor tonight to talk to Angus Robertson about his new book, which we, hopefully some of us have already read, and if you haven't yet, there are plenty to purchase later on. But we want to pick Angus's brain a little bit about his time in Vienna, how he gathered the courage to do this much research into something so vast and endless as Vienna's diplomatic history. And so to start out, I'd just like to talk about a little bit your time when you were here in Vienna, those 10 years at ORF and with the BBC World Service. You were covering diplomatic affairs, international affairs here. What were the biggest highlights where you say, this is what I wanted to write home about? This is the stuff I knew I was doing my job for.
Well, first off, thanks very much, Maggie. For those of you who don't know Maggie Childs, she's the chief executive of Metropole magazine, which is the main English language publication in the city, which is a terrific read, which you can pick up on the cat when you arrive in the city and throughout.
And subscribe.
And you can subscribe. Product placement for the magazine and now for the book. Before answering your question, though, can I just say a few words? Firstly, to Emil and colleagues at the Diplomatic Academy, it's a tremendous honor to be here. I'm I'm touched that you were prepared to host the event. It means a lot to me, especially given the nature of the book. This is the place to do a book presentation about it. I've known you for a long time, and I'm exceptionally grateful for your friendship and the ability to be here. To the city of Vienna, I'm honored that you are here and that you were able to lay out some of the remarkable dimensions of the city. And I just reflect on one thing before answering the question. You can tell I'm a politician in the meantime, can't you? I haven't even begun to answer the question. Is that everything that you said was remarkable, and you can't buy a book about it? Isn't it remarkable? I mean, Emil, you said at the start, it's completely natural for people in Vienna, and that includes all of you, regardless of where you're from. We all sort of become a little bit Viennese in our own ways. We kind of take all of this for granted. And perhaps because we take it for granted, nobody kind of thought that it might actually be quite an interesting topic. And that's what this is. And I'll come back to that in a second, because, Maggie, you were asking me about how I got to all of this. I should also say I kind of fell into this purely by chance. Some of you will know this, and I see a lot of friends around the room, and it's really nice to see you all. I actually came here 30 years ago this very month to be a language assistant, a Sprachassistent, or as one says so nicely in Viennese, a Beiwagerl. So I was a Beiwagerl for all of 3 months in the 21st district in Polgerstrasse in the Bundeshandelsakademie. And then by pure chance, somebody, a friend of mine at that time, said, you're kind of interested in Scotland and politics and all of that. Why don't you do journalism? I'm like, well, how do you do journalism? They said, well, you write something and then you get it published. And I'm like, okay, but is it as simple as that, is it? And it literally was as simple as that. I wrote something and I marched into the editorial offices of Provincial, which at that time, I'm not sure they're there anymore, but at that stage was in Mark-Aurel-Strasse. And I asked to speak to the editor. I didn't even know who the editor was. And this lovely gentleman walked past, and the receptionist said, Herr Ostenhof, this young man from Scotland is here to see you. And he said, come in. Herein. And I explained that I was working here, and I was interested in journalism, and he said, no, home to us. And I said, well, here's something I prepared earlier. And he said, no, das drucken wir nächste Woche. And I'm like, seriously? And that was great. And I remember getting up very, very early in the morning to go to the Franz Josefs Bahnhof to find a colporteur who was selling the Profil. And there it was, my goodness. And I thought, wow, maybe this journalism thing might fly. And then I thought, I remember the sister of somebody I was at school with worked at the ORF. Joanna Bostock, who worked at that time for one Tilia Herald, who I name is sitting in the second row, who was the then controller of Blue Danube Radio, the fourth national net. Well, at that stage it wasn't national, the fourth radio station of the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. It later broadcast throughout the country. And I literally turned up in the Argentinierstrasse. Quite why the ORF has moved. I'm getting beyond my competence here by asking why the ORF has moved the Funkhaus to. Well, anyway, yeah. I'm going to get myself into trouble, so I'll stop before I get myself into. I've got to be very careful now. I'm an external affairs minister. I can't hold forth as I used to do as a reporter. I've got to be a bit more careful. But I walked into the Funkhaus and rang up to speak to Joanna Bostock, who had no idea that I was coming. I said, I was in class with your brother Jason at Broughton High School in Edinburgh. She went, oh, really? And what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm a language assistant and I'm interested in journalism. And literally, as this conversation was taking place, one Tilia Herald walked past and Joanna Bostock said, here's somebody from Scotland who's interested in journalism. Tilia Herald literally took me into her office and said, well, what do you know about journalism? And I said, here's the last thing that I did.
Little did she know it was the first thing that you did.
Correct. And I was being entirely truthful. It was the last thing I did. It's the only thing I'd ever done. And she gave me a break. And I am Tilia, I'm going to embarrass you here, I'm eternally grateful for you taking a punt on me, and you took a punt on a great many people. And it is a testament to your picking of talent. If you look around some of the leading international broadcasters of the world, from the BBC World Service to CNN to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, I can go on, they're full of people who work for the ORF, and the fewest people in Vienna know that there are people who have become tremendous journalists. My successor, while I was working for the ORF, I also worked for the BBC. You may have heard of her, Katja Adler. She's one of the biggest names in the BBC now. Started off as the children's presenter of Blue Danube Radio. I've still not answered your question.
No.
Forgive
You're
me,
not
Maggie.
even trying.
I'm not even trying. I'm sorry. So let us get back on. I just wanted to do some thank yous and a little bit of scene setting about how I got here, because so that's how I got into journalism. I got these amazing breaks. I had a bit of brass neck. I managed to be in the right place at the right time. Within a few short weeks of arriving, Tilia asked me, would I go to the former Yugoslavia to do some recordings with refugees for an ad campaign that was about to be started for a charitable undertaking that we all know in the meantime, Nachbar in Not, Neighbor in Need, which has become the biggest charitable undertaking in Austria, I think I'm right in saying. And myself and a colleague from Ö3 drove down to Croatia, and we interviewed a lot of refugees who were literally coming off trucks. They were mostly women, their husbands were not with them. You began to understand what was going on with all of this. It was utterly shocking. It was whatever it was, 3 hours from Vienna, 3.5 hours from Vienna. And this was happening on our doorstep, and I became quite involved with all of that. So this was, I suppose, this was one of the big I was here between 1991 and 1999, so you can join the dots of what was going on about that stage. And Vienna was very much a fulcrum for Central Europe, for very obvious reasons, and in particular, understanding what was going on in that part of the world. And there were all kinds of people who were passing through the Funkhaus regularly. I remember, you'll remember some of these names, like Haris Salajic, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of Bosnia-Herzegovina, was here quite a lot. There were many others. And so although we were here, you were very connected with there, if that makes sense. So that was, I actually think amongst the first things I ever did, it was amongst the biggest things that I did, actually, because it would just open my eyes, and it showed me why journalism mattered, because by being in that place and recording the voices of these people, you were helping raise money for them ultimately. Skip forward to just before I left here, I did the story which, because of my I'm tremendously interested in history, I did a report for the BBC World Service and for National Public Radio in the States about the then, let me get my sums right, 80th anniversary of the 11th and decisive Battle of Isonzo in Slovenia. Now, most people in the English-speaking world have never heard, well, they've never heard of Slovenia, let alone the battles of Isonzo. And I had become very interested, as one does, living in Vienna, in the whole history of the place. And I went down to report on this anniversary. And what I really, really wanted to find was anybody who had been there. So you're talking about 1997. And I spoke with Manfred Rauchensteiner, who many of you will know, who at that time was the head of the Military History Museum and one of Austria's finest academics in military history. And we had this conversation. I was saying, give me a tip, help me out, how can I find some of these? Oh, well, they're these old brothers in Upper Austria, but they've kind of lost it. And he said, the best way to do it is maybe we can do a search on people who are still getting a pension because they had the Maria Theresian Orden. I'm thinking, holy moly, this is getting pretty obscure. And then suddenly in the ORF, there was a film that was shown which included this Slovenian man called Ivan Kovacic. And Manfred Rauchensteiner put me in touch with people who would know him. And I went and interviewed him. And he was able to tell me as a journalist. I mean, it was just radio gold. You could not have made this stuff up. He had lived under 11 flags in his lifetime and never moved. Mm-hmm. I asked him to say what his name was, who he served with and for, and what he thought about it. And that was a clip that I ultimately used. He said, "My name's Ivan Kovacic. I am 98 years old. I served with the 97th Regiment of the Austro-Hungarian Army as a machine gunner, the Bad Radkersburg Regiment, Bad Radgonana." And he said, "If I knew what I now know and they promised me every medal to do it again, I'd say I don't want them." Mm-hmm. So there you had this voice from the past talking to me about this world, this Central European world, with all of its complications. And those are my two best journalistic reminiscences about here. There are so many others. I covered the UN Human Rights Conference. I met some remarkable people. I was able to do profiles of some amazing people. And I just loved being a journalist here for 10 years because so much happened here. That's a long and winding answer to...
I think it's a fantastic lead into to talking about the kinds of things that happen in Vienna and Vienna's changing power across the continent. If we're looking specifically at diplomacy in the most classical sense of the word, negotiations, diplomatic relations, international ties being formed, treaties being signed, things like this, do you think now, after researching this book, that you can really say there's a red thread or some kind of cultural thing about Vienna or the Viennese people or Viennese something that makes this such a powerful place to negotiate?
Wow. Well, I should have said right at the start, Maggie, I have been dreading, of the 3 book presentations that I've done, Edinburgh, London, and Vienna, this is the one I've been really worried about because I can't blag this audience. Yeah. Because you know what I'm talking about.
Literally preaching to the choir.
To front. I am looking at more retired ambassadors, serving ambassadors, diplomats from a whole series of countries, academics, and people who are interested in this kind of stuff. So I'm really on the spot with all of this. So I should say the book originally was intended to be called Vienna, the Diplomatic Capital. Mm-hmm. It was to be a pure explanation of how diplomacy was important, has become very important to Vienna, and is very important to the world because of what happened here. Most people don't actually understand that the rules of modern diplomacy were agreed here in their first form at the Congress of Vienna. And if you look at the current treaties, both on diplomatic relations and consular relations, which are used at this present time, they are treaties that were signed and negotiated in Vienna in the 20th century. And as you will all know, so I don't need to rehearse all this, you go through a whole series of things, the most important of which obviously was the Congress of Vienna. And at the same time, you have the growth over centuries of the importance and relevance of the Habsburg Empire in its variety of forms. Vienna becoming this fulcrum of power, of money, of prestige, and sucking in some of the greatest talents from around Europe. And that, to me, has actually been the most interesting thing, because there will be people in the room who might say, well, what about this Austrian diplomat or that Austrian foreign minister? Or not everybody's in it. Well, it's one volume. I couldn't really do the whole shebang. In actual fact, the thing that I found more interesting, without wanting to suggest that people from this neck of the woods were not worthy of as much coverage, was I was even more interested in the people who came to be here. Who became part of the Austrian story. Now, this might be really, really obvious to Austrians, but when you explain to people firth of here that the country's greatest military leader was a Frenchman who couldn't serve for the French because he was gay, whose statue stands in Heroes Square, if you want to talk about one of the greatest figures of the get my centuries right here, of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, Prince de Ligne was, by today's standards, a Belgian, born in Brussels, then part of Austria. And I could go on and on and on. The list of these people who came from elsewhere to be here and played such an important role in making this an important city, they played their part in making that happen. And then, of course, you know, Metternich, the greatest of them all when you want to talk about diplomacy, was not from here. He came here and he became the greatest diplomat of the 19th century. The whole system of diplomacy, and certainly the first half of the 19th century, is named after him. He played a seminal role in ensuring that Vienna was a diplomatic capital in addition to being this military and great power status which Prince Eugene and others had ergattert. That's a great thing about being in Vienna. I can speak Denglish again, so forgive me if I occasionally throw.
Very free.
Is there? Your question was: Is there a golden thread through all of this? I'm not sure there is. What I think is more important, and this is particularly relevant to the city of Vienna, I think, is that this city has managed to reinvent itself a great number of times. And that, to me, is actually the most important thread running through the history of things.
Adaptability.
Exactly, the ability to change, because if you think back, or try and think, well, none of us can think back to how people felt in 1918, about the end of an empire, of a sense of being a big thing and now being here, being a small thing in an oversized capital city for a country at that stage. I'm guessing probably about 5 million. It would have been unimaginable to think that this city is what it is today. 10 years in a row, the highest quality of life of any city in the world. 61% of people living in public housing. The killer fact on that is, and I think I'm right in saying is, Vienna is the biggest public landlord in the world after the People's Republic of China. It is remarkable. And think about this for a second. So you had a country hollowed out during the First World War, literally starving, particularly in this city. I don't know if any of you have asked yourself why there are so many streets which have Scandinavian names. They have them because the city of Vienna named them after the Scandinavian nations that fed the poor of the city after the First World War, because people were starving. And that one would go from that to obviously 25 years of very difficult times, from 1918 until 1945, and it wasn't easy after 1945, but people began to think of a new and a different city, and they totally reimagined how it could be relevant. And there are some people who played a really big part in that. Sure, we'll come back to some people like Bruno Kreisky, but many others. They reimagined a city that would be relevant to the world, and not just in the terms of the empire and of power politics and of being a great force. And that, to me, is one of the most, and should never be taken for granted, and should not be set in aspic. And anyway, that would be my one appeal, because I think Vienna has been remarkable in adapting to history, sometimes exceptionally difficult history, sometimes making wrong decisions, sometimes making amazing decisions. I mean, how on earth one could build the public housing stock that Vienna has within a few short years of being defeated in the First World War, where people are starving. I mean, we find it difficult to build. I mean, we're thinking of trying to build 100,000 public houses in Scotland, or social housing, and doing it within 5 years. In the 21st century, not at the beginning of the 20th century when we're bankrupted, which is, anyway. So a remarkable city that was able to do remarkable things and was able to reimagine things, and I think that diplomacy is a part of that, but only just a part of that.
So Vienna, the adaptable capital, has a ring to it as well.
It does.
Not bad. But let me hazard a hypothesis about this kind of cultural thing, and I think you'll agree with part of it at least. the thing about Vienna, perhaps that can really set it apart from other cities culturally, I think, has a lot to do with privacy, and this kind of respect for other people's sphere, other people's areas. Perhaps this is also a reason why corruption is so rampant here. However, the respect for privacy being there. For instance, when we drive around the city and you see a Kennzeichen, there we go, I can do the English. With
Number plate.
Number plate, there we go, with the WD on it, it means Wiener Diplomat. But many of the people with those number plates are not the classical diplomats, as we say, but are in intelligence units or things like this. And these kind of how should I say, these kind of traditions that go on because they work here, isn't that something that is culturally Viennese?
Now that's a very, very, very interesting question. So in the book, product placement, the role of espionage is very significant in Vienna. It was significant before the Congress of Vienna, but it became an industry during the Congress of Vienna. For those of you who don't know this, it always tickles me, is my favorite Vienna coffee house is Bräunerhof. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Anyway, I like Café Bräunerhof. And you're looking at the back of the Mews, where the Spanish riding school, the Lipizzanas now are. And in that corner that you're looking at from where Bräunerhof is, that is where the Schwarzes Kabinett was at that time. That is where, overnight, the secret police used to open all of the correspondence and would copy it and then would reseal it. And that was the start of Vienna becoming a really pretty big center for espionage. There are amazing stories. The biggest of them all, when one talks about Vienna, is Redl, of course, who sold most of the secrets of the Austrian military to the Russians to fund his lifestyle, and that being just before the First World War. So that was a huge story. But it's especially relevant then after the Second World War, where Vienna became the place to be, and not just the third man. But there was a lot of espionage going on, involving, and the book names them. I mean, the people who were here are pretty much a who's who of the intelligence community from the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the Czechoslovak Secret Service, the Hungarian Secret Service. There are others, but most of the big cheeses in the intelligence community worldwide had been here, had served here, and that remains the case today. And it's the thing that polite diplomacy doesn't talk about. It's just part of the nature of international relations. The larger countries that have diplomatic presences here, pretty much all of them have a percentage of the accredited diplomatic staff are double-hatted. So they will appear as John Le Carré, who also worked in Austria for MI6, described as being the second secretary for paperclips. And they've got a job to do. And one of the interesting things about that is one of the reasons why Vienna remains an important center for espionage in the intelligence community is because there's a kind of live and let live.
That's what I mean with the privacy, yeah.
Don't ask, don't tell. Don't bring your dirty business here. But if you want to follow each other around and you want to meet people and you want to influence people, there's a lot of that goes on here. And the number plates, if X%, I think it was reckoned that during the Cold War that, and I think I'm right in saying this, that it was a third to a half of the entire Czechoslovak embassy were intelligence officers. That was the scale of. Now, it would be a lot less than that now, because obviously the Cold War isn't as it was, but there are still a significant number of people who work here at embassies and in the international organizations. And it, so long as people don't transgress, and so long as one isn't seeking to destabilize the Austrian state, what happens on tour stays on tour, sort of thing. And so Vienna is viewed as a very sort of cushy posting, and it's very enjoyable. And but let's not mess around with this kind of thing. This is a global phenomenon. This isn't an Austrian phenomenon. It just happens to be this is a place where a lot of people meet for a lot of reasons, and amongst them, the intelligence spying piece is a bit of that as well, and it's in the book.
Maybe you know this. The law about espionage in Austria, I think, if I remember correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, that countries or individuals are allowed to spy on each other in Austria, but not allowed to spy on Austria. Is that correct?
I think that's the view that is taken on it. But I think it's largely
Interpretation.
Yeah. I mean, there are amazing stories, some of them that just didn't make the cut because otherwise the book would be just far too big and just about this. But, this aspect is really quite interesting. I mean, the stories of sort of Koreans following Koreans, as in North Koreans following South Koreans, or South Koreans following North Koreans who are, trying to fiddle with people's phone lines, and some hotels having things installed in walls. And I mean, there are great stories. One of the best stories, incidentally, it goes back to the time when Vienna was still occupied. And many of you will know this, but unlike Berlin, which was divided east-west, as we know, and then in the west it was divided by the three Western powers, in Vienna, the occupying forces occupied different districts. It actually didn't make a lot of sense about where the Brits were, the Americans were, and the Russians were, and where the French were. And so one of the British zones was directly adjacent to the Soviet zone, where the main telephone line went from Soviet military headquarters out to Schwechat and then to Moscow.
Bad planning there.
And British engineers dug a tunnel from beneath a shop, underneath a road, managed to put the clips onto the telephone lines, and managed to collect so much information from the Soviets that MI6 had to set up a whole new department in London, in Carlton Gardens, purely to deal with the intelligence from this one operation. And there were plenty more. That's one that is known about, but there are plenty other stories. Anyway, some of that's in the book.
So read more about it in the book. The other part about this aspect about this that is kind of the elephant in the room, if you don't mind, in this room here, we have a bunch of people that are actually from Vienna. Mm-hmm. And you're sitting here as a foreigner. I mean, I don't know, maybe we don't have anyone from Vienna, perhaps. But people who choose to be in Vienna, as you said before, are generally the people who change Vienna. And you, as an outsider, writing about this aspect of this city's history and the city's identity, what gives you the right, or is it an advantage?
Good question. I think it kind of helps being from elsewhere, but having spent a long enough length of time to sort of get beyond some of the early stereotypes that most of us pick up, and many of us who are not from here originally probably had a lot of stereotypes, and then over time some of them were not borne out, some of them were borne out, but you have a more subtle and nuanced understanding of the city, of the culture, of the history of the place. That's definitely the case. What's the classic Robert Burns line, Scotland's national poet, about giving us the gift to see ourselves as others see us? And I think there's definitely something in that to be able to perhaps be slightly more dispassionate about a place or about history, and then try and pull that all together. I mean, I'm really good. I'm tremendously interested in what the feedback is going to be from Viennese friends. I really hope that people find that there's something new in this, because one of the things about writing the book, when it changed from being purely from Vienna diplomatic capital to being Vienna an international capital, the way I chose to do that was to try and identify interesting people through the history of here who wrote about it. So they were travelers, they were letter writers, they were diplomats' wives, they were people who passed through, they were people who moved here. I drew up a list not that long ago to try and work out a list of who all of these people are. There's some remarkable people in the book. Just one vignette, because it's relevant for here. There's a woman called Lady Montague Wortley, who was the wife of the British ambassador to be in Constantinople. Constantinople being obviously the other side of Europe from London. And so they traveled across land and then down the Danube, and they stayed in Vienna for 3 months. And she wrote about here, she wrote about being in Constantinople. She's viewed as one of the first English language women, female travel writers, writing about Muslim women, and a remarkable lady. She is one of the most interesting people to have written about Vienna, in my opinion. Quite apart from the fact that most of the men are tremendously self-important. So the things that they write about, to me, are actually less important than what many of the women wrote about, because she was writing about social life, about housing, about people and how they lived, about social mores, sexual mores of the time. The juicy stuff. And one of the things that she recalls was coming to an opera here, but when I say here, the back garden. So this is the Favorita Palace, for those of you who don't know. This is where Maria Theresia was born. And in 1716, she came to the premiere of an opera written by a very famous, at that time, since then forgotten Austrian Baroque composer called Fuchs. And he wrote many operas, but this was a gargantuan production that took place in what would have been the private grounds of the Favorita Palace, which is now, between the former ORF staff canteen and the football pitch at the back of the Theresianum. There you had this monstrous set that was built, including a lake where boats were floating on it, and I managed to work out 18 million euros. Wow. For a one-night performance here at the back. Anyway, she describes all of it's just amazing. So she's a favorite of mine, and my other one is 2 Maoris who made it here. And many of you will have heard about the Novara, which was the Austrian frigate that circumnavigated the world in the 1850s. But many people don't know that it actually arrived back with more people than it left with. And that's because when they arrived in New Zealand, they met New Zealand Maoris who were surprised, to say the least, that there was another emperor. They had been told by the British powers that be that there was only one empress, well, certainly only one who mattered. And they thought, well, hold on a second, there's another emperor. Who's this? And they said, well, we have to meet this other emperor. And so they asked the commander of the Novara, could they meet the emperor? And he said, yeah, we'll take you back. So 2 literate Christian Maori men got on the Novara and came back with the boat, and then spent 3 months living here, working in the Austrian State Printing Works, and they wrote a diary in the Maori language about Vienna in the 1850s. They were given an audience with the emperor. What they said to him is recorded, what he said to them is recorded, and as they left, Archduke Maximilian, let's not talk too much about him and how he got on in Mexico, he said to them, is there anything that we can give you from Austria to take back to New Zealand? And they said, we'd like a printing press. And a printing press was transported to New Zealand, and on that was printed the first Maori language newspaper, which underneath in its masthead was, with grateful thanks to His Apostolic Majesty, the Emperor of Austria. So just 2 little vignettes about amazing people who were here that most of you probably don't know about. And the book is just full of these people. Did I mention the book? And I mean, I've not even got onto the Irish. I'm seeing at least one Irish friend of mine in the audience. Will you allow me just briefly to say something about the Irish?
Go for it.
Please, Maggie.
I'm also Irish heritage, you can
Great.
Spill it all.
Well,
it's fine.
I've been having great fun telling what I'm about to tell you to people I know in the Irish diplomatic service, because most of them don't know it. And it really tickles me, which is the Irish diplomatic service is a very, very effective small diplomatic service. And one of the things they do incredibly well is network and get on with people, and they do that very well, especially one night a year on St. Patrick's Day, where most Irish embassies hold a St. Patrick's Day reception, and all the great and the good are invited, and one gets to know one another, and that's kind of soft power and all of that. What the least people in the Irish diplomatic service know is that the first ever diplomatic reception for St. Patrick's Day, marking St. Patrick's Day, took place here in this very city in the 1760s, when the then imperial Spanish ambassador, listen very closely to the name, Demetrio O'Mahony, a very Spanish name, invited a long list of Austrian dignitaries to attend a St. Patrick's Day reception. And these Austrian guests of honor, who were all Austrian field marshals and privy councillors and super important people, had the very Austrian-sounding names of Lacy, O'Donnell, McElhaney, and the list goes on and on and on. And there's another nationality that played an inordinate influence in this country, even two prime ministers of the 19th century were Irish Austrians, Tafe, as it's pronounced here. And the last living recipient of the Maria Theresia Orden was one Gottfried von Banfield, another Irish Austrian. I could go on. Anyway, it's all in the book.
So Austria has basically got its feelers all over the world, has influenced changes in all kinds of things, put the printing press in New Zealand, all of these wonderful things. Can Vienna keep it up, is my question to you now. I mean, we have all this historical, very much history in this book. But also recently, we've had, the Iran talks were here. You have the biggest decisions in the world still being made here. Is that going to keep going, or do we still have the secret sauce?
Good question. I think the honest answer is, at this stage, nobody knows. But I'm sure the powers that be in the Austrian Foreign Ministry and those who professionally think a lot about these things, I think this is something that people do think about quite a lot, and I think they're right to do that. The inheritance of Austria as a center for multilateral diplomacy, and there are people in the room here who work for multilateral organizations, one can almost sort of take it for granted that this is a third global headquarters of the United Nations. It's the headquarters of the OSCE. It's the headquarters of the IAEA. It's the headquarters of OPEC. There's about 40 multilateral and international organizations. I mean, you cannot take that for granted. It's a remarkable achievement to have made Vienna the place to be. And it happened at a particular point in time, and I would largely credit the former Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky with this, and one of the seminar rooms is named after him for this reason, which is he understood that Austria could reimagine itself, going back to this theme I was talking about before, as being a small country that could play a relevant role in the world. And he literally made it so. And the story about how he got the Americans to agree to the UN being headquartered here when he asked the then American president whether he was in agreement with the suggestion that should be the case, which I think took place at Schwechat Airport, with the din of the planes going on at the time. It's actually thought that he didn't answer the question. And Bruno Kreisky came back and confirmed that the decision had been made. And so it was. And the UN came to Vienna and the rest of its history. So
diplomacy for you.
So that's part of the diplomatic skills, no doubt. And so you have these multilateral organizations doing very important work, but it's not necessarily everyday work which is noticed elsewhere. Because if diplomacy is working, it doesn't involve conflict, it doesn't involve war, it involves a lot of meetings, it involves a lot of conferences, it involves a lot of incremental steps, and it's not always super newsworthy. And on the one hand, that's a great thing. But on the other hand, it means that one can perhaps lose sight of the fact of what there is and why it's important. And the kind of glory days of Khrushchev, Kennedy, and of Sadat and Golda Meir and all of these people that we know from what was going on in Austrian foreign policy in the 1970s and then in the 1980s, we are in a different age now. Now, we have the Iran nuclear talks, and those took place here, but other people have kind of got into the game of doing what Austria has been able to do. So obviously Geneva is a very important diplomatic center in Europe. We know this. Brussels is very important. It's the European Union and NATO. Some other countries have realized that they have a similar tale to tell. The Finns do it. The Swedes do it. We remember the talks with Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev being in Iceland. So it's now a more crowded field. So my question back, I suppose, is does one just carry on as before and hoping, because it's very well funded, the city of Vienna, the Austrian federal government puts a lot of resource into all of this, and to its credit, I have to say, I think it's tremendous that this is done. But a lot of effort goes into making sure that Vienna remains an important international capital, and that's a good thing. My question, though, is does one just carry on as one has done and hope that the next big conflict is resolved here or the next big standoff sees people meeting here? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know it is the question. And I think if you are thinking about this as a question, you'll probably come up to the answer because of all we've been talking about the ability to reimagine things. And if I leave you with one thought about that in particular, I just reflect on the country in this way for a second. You now have a justice minister in this country who came here as a refugee from Bosnia. This city is, I think I'm now right in saying, the fourth biggest community of Afghans in the world. So, in 20 or 30 years, can you imagine an Austrian foreign minister whose first language is Pashtun? Maybe some of you can, maybe some of you can't. But it seems to me one of the strengths of this country is that it has, and forever, it has brought in people from elsewhere, people who've come from different places within the empire, out with the empire, out with the continent now, and this is now home. So to what extent does one view that as a strength, or does one view that as a challenge? I think it's a bit of both, but I think there is something in this as being one of the offerings that Vienna has to in the international community of nations.
I think that's a beautiful way to look in the future. I think Espionage is also a great example of that kind of diversity that governments or ministries have slowly started having in Vienna as well. So everyone, I'm going to open up to all of you and your questions that we can delve even deeper into Angus's brain. But before I do that, I just wanted to really quickly, maybe a round of applause for his storytelling ability. Am I right?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, there's a question at the end.
Yes.
How long did it take you to write this book? And for how many decades have you collected all this?
Good question. So the answer, as the director in his introductory remarks drew attention to the fact I was a politician in the British Parliament for 16 years, and then I was not in the British Parliament for 4 years until I was elected to the Scottish Parliament this year. And so it is these 4 years that I have used to research. My darling wife sitting at the back with our 4-month-old daughter, who I don't know if she's going to be heckling at any stage. There she is. I have to pay credit to her toleration for me spending time in the National Library in Edinburgh, in the National Library here in Vienna, and the Haus, Hof und Staatsarchiv, which is a remarkable place. Find an excuse to go. It's an absolutely, to hold in your hands, as I was able to do, letters from Queen Victoria to Emperor Franz Joseph, to my dear brother. Amazing. And so, to answer your question, I essentially spent 4 years working on this, and I really enjoyed the process. I have to be honest, I didn't actually write it with anybody else in mind. I wrote it for me, if that makes sense. This was the book that I was never able to buy here. I don't know if the penny has dropped. It's quite bizarre to think about this. There has never been a book written about Vienna in either German or English about this subject, which is crazy if you think about it. You can buy great books on the history of Vienna, on the history of Vienna and the Habsburgs, on Vienna and any number of people, good, bad, and indifferent, on its culture, on its music, and all of that. But in this city, where the government, national and provincial city, views its international status as being of prime importance, of a bridge-building city and country, for there to not actually have been a work up until now which draws attention to all of that has been a gap that I have known about for a long time, but never had the time, the ability, or the patience to do. But I suddenly had this enforced change of circumstances, which let me research all of this. And while I was doing that, I had the good fortune to be invited to be a guest lecturer in this august institution, which was a great excuse for me to come here and research things. So.
And that's your third overlap with Henry Kissinger, right? You have the politics, you have the book now, right? The historical book, and guest lecturing here.
Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
So yes, well, so there are some parallels. There's some I wouldn't be concluding, but it is true. He was in politics. He was a historian, and he wrote his PhD about the Congress of Vienna, and he did lecture here. And there's a lovely quote, also in the book, where he refers to his time lecturing at the Diplomatic Academy, where I can't quite work out whether he's commending or condemning the institution for serving everything with cream, Schlag. But you still do, which is very nice. So yeah. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been able to come here and to, if you haven't been yet and used your national library here or the Federal Archives, find an excuse and do it, because they are remarkable what they have there.
Absolutely. More questions or comments or here we go.
To what extent, Angus, did your experiences here in Vienna influence your decision to enter Scottish politics in a big way and in support of the Scottish National Party and independence?
Right. I'll give you the
question.
shorter. I'll give you the shorter rather than longer answer. So, after being here, it didn't take very long to realize that I thought that Austria was a tremendous place, that it was a smaller European country, and that in many respects, I thought that how Austria governs itself, in many respects, is to be commended, and that should be something that we in Scotland should emulate. For those of you who don't know, Scotland and Austria are almost exactly the same size, 85,000 square kilometers. Your population is larger, 9 million, we're just over 5 million. And obviously we have been part of an empire. Austria has been part of an empire.
So much in common.
And interesting factet in all of this, which are the only two European states that at the beginnings of football as a sport never had a national football team. One was the United Kingdom. The other one was Austria-Hungary, which never performed as a football team. So whenever anybody tells you that Otto Habsburg joke about turning up in a hotel and the football match being on and the receptionist saying that the game's, it's an Austria-Hungary match, to which he says, "Who are we playing?" Not true. There never was an Austro-Hungarian football team. So my Austrian experience showed me that it was possible for a small country to be successful, for it to have a very large cultural neighbor with which one was related, Germany, and in our case England, that history has, through the century, been a mixture of good, bad, and indifferent, and that notwithstanding that, it was perfectly possible to have a relationship as neighbors in the then 20th century, now 21st century, which is amicable and collegial, with open borders and within the European Union. And now we find ourselves in Scotland, having voted by 62% to remain within the European Union, only 2 years after having been told we should vote no to Scottish independence as a guarantee of remaining in the European Union. We find ourselves having been deprived of our European citizenship rights and being taken out of the biggest single market in the world. And we're not having it. And I was elected in May, winning the seat of the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party's seat, together with colleagues that form a majority in the Scottish Parliament, not just one party, but two parties forming a majority in the Scottish Parliament, who believe that the people of Scotland should have a say in this subject. And it's coming, because every single age group in the Scottish population younger than 55, and in some cases younger than 65, is in favour of Scottish independence. And so, if Boris Johnson were actually sensible about things, he would agree to there being a referendum now, because if one leaves it longer, it makes it even less likely that there may be a no vote. But I believe that Austria and other European Union countries should prepare for Scotland becoming a sovereign state and a fellow member state of the European Union. We'd be net contributors. We would be one of the wealthiest countries in the history of the world to become independent, and we look forward to working with neighbours and friends, including Austria.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. In case you were wondering if diplomacy doesn't just happen right here. Do we have other questions, thoughts, comments? Expletives, also fine.
Anything.
Anything. Otherwise, we can wrap it up and go
Okay.
into the... Oh,
Yes.
sorry.
Do I miss Vienna? I am probably the most loyal viewer of ZIP 2 in Britain, and I read Der Standard, Die Presse, Profil. Again, I'm probably the most avid reader of all of these, and Falter, I should say now. Some of their coverage has been very important to read in recent times. I miss friends a lot. I was here, as you know, for 10 years, and it's a difficult so I was here in my 20s, and these are some of the best friendships you form. And as we know, you can try your best to keep up with people, and I have tried very hard, and not just the Facebook thing, but coming back and trying to touch base with people. And I still do that, and it still means a lot to me. And my wife Jennifer and I were having this conversation. She was saying to me, I shouldn't be saying this, she was saying to me on the way into town, she said, "Would you ever like to move back?" To which the politician's answer is, "I'd never left." Because there's a bit of me that is always here. But I could very happily live in Vienna. Who knows? Perhaps when Scotland becomes a sovereign state and we have our own diplomatic service. If somebody would do me the honour of offering me a position as secretary for paperclips in Vienna, that I would happily take that up. But you know, Vienna is a great place for those of you who are not from here originally, yourself included, and there are others who, by making the choice of remaining here, say everything that needs to be said about how an amazing place this is. And if there were one wish that I would want to impart back to friends in Vienna, to Austrian friends, is sometimes I get the feeling that people here don't actually understand how good it is here. Because notwithstanding all the challenges, all the scandals, all the politics, everything that one feels should be better, and no doubt many of these things, whatever they are, should be better. We should always strive for better. But it is a remarkable city in a remarkable country, and all of you should be tremendously proud of it, and seek to sort out any of the blemishes that need sorting out in the meantime. But it is an amazing place, and I would be honored to live here. In the meantime, I've got a job to be getting on with, not least for the good people of Edinburgh Central, and I have other responsibilities too. So I will be pleased to come back as often as I can, and what the future might hold down the track, who knows?
So, let's wrap it up.
Let's wrap it up. I think, have I mentioned that there's a book that's available? If any of you would like to purchase from the fantastic Shakespeare & Company, we are blessed in the city to have such a tremendous English language bookshop. If you would like to purchase a copy of the book, if any of you would wish me to write something inside it, I'd be happy to do that. I think I'll be sticking around for a little bit at the end to say hello to. There's a great many friends here who I'd like to say hello to. On that note, before the microphone is switched off, again, my thanks to you for chairing so ably. Thank you. To Emil and colleagues, thank you very much. And to all of you, thank you for coming along. One last thought. In case you don't know this is one of the few books ever to have a soundtrack.
Spotify playlist.
And so if you are interested and you can play Spotify on Alexa or whatever you've got at home, just type in or speak in Vienna, the international capital. I've put together a playlist that starts with Salieri, believe it or not, includes the original version of the Kaiser hymn, which you won't hear very often, and ends with Falco. And there's quite a lot in between. So if you'd like to listen to a bit of music that's connected with the book and connected with the city, try the playlist. Thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you. Thank you.